The snow and the stranger. The wind howled like a starving wolf outside Jacob Wyatt's cabin, clawing at the shutters and sweeping powdery snow against the log walls. Inside, the fire snapped with stubborn defiance, casting amber light across the rough-hewn floor. Jacob sat at the table, calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of bitter coffee. His rifle leaned against the door. He always kept it close. 36 winters had weathered his body like the mountain ranges beyond, carving lines into his brow and sanding down his spirit. A former soldier turned frontiersman, he'd long since traded the sound of marching boots for solitude and the company of men for silence. It had been 5 years since he'd buried his wife, and still he spoke to her sometimes in the quiet hours. That morning, before the storm had grown fangs, he'd gone to check the trapline. He hadn't meant to wander far, but some instinct honed in old battlefields, had pulled him westward toward the low pass. What he found there would change everything. Half buried in the snow near a thicket of frozen pine was a shape that didn't belong. He thought it might be a wolf at first, until the shape stared, feebly lifting an arm. It was a woman. She was clutching a bundle to her chest, the faintest cry of a baby barely rising above the wind. Around her, small shadows lay unmoving. 5 children in total, faces blue from cold. Jacob didn't hesitate. He wrapped them in his fur-lined cloak, carrying the baby against his chest and lifting the unconscious woman into his arms. One by one, he hauled them back to his cabin, breath burning in his lungs, legs numbing from cold. By the time he closed the door behind him, the storm had swallowed the trail. The woman lay near the fire now, her children nestled beside her, wrapped in every wool blanket he owned. He stoked the flames higher and poured water into a pot, praying they hadn't arrived too late. She began to stir as dusk fell. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, alert, and fierce. She tried to sit, wincing in pain, and shielded the youngest child with her body. "You're safe," Jacob said gently, hands open. "You in my home. No harm will come." She stared, unmoving. "I'm Jacob Wyatt," he added, gesturing toward the fire. "This is all I got, but it's yours for now." After a moment, she nodded once, cautious, skeptical. As he fed the fire again, his thoughts strayed unwillingly to Eliza Morton. Her scent still lingered faintly on his shirt from their last meeting beneath the cottonwoods. That had been 3 nights ago, secret and forbidden. Her lips had trembled with guilt, but her hands had clung to him like drowning to driftwood. She had whispered, "You're not like the others, Jacob, but they'll kill us if they find out." He had wanted to believe he was a better man, but sheltering in the arms of another man's wife said otherwise. The woman on the floor shifted, drawing his attention. She reached for the baby, whose small chest now rose and fell steadily. "You saved us," she rasped. Her voice was hoarse, but melodic. "I did what any man should." "No," she replied, eyes narrowing. "Most would have left us for the wolves." Jacob didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a tin plate from the shelf and offered her some dried venison stew. She took it slowly, wary but too hungry to refuse. "What's your name?" he asked. "Naeli," she said. "My husband was killed last moon. Soldiers burned our camp. I ran. I thought I could get my children to safety." Jacob's jaw tightened. He had worn that same uniform once, had followed orders he never spoke of now. The shame lingered like blood under his fingernails. "You're safe here," he said again, "till you can move." Her gaze softened, just a flicker, and she nodded. Outside, the wind began to die, leaving only the groaning of ice-covered branches. Inside, 6 lives had been pulled back from the brink. As Jacob sat across from Naeli, watching her feed her children with trembling hands, he felt something shift. Not attraction, not yet, but a recognition. A woman broken by loss, refusing to let it consume her. He stared into the fire and thought of Eliza's last words. "They'll kill you if they find out. But if they ever found Naeli here, they wouldn't just kill him. They'd kill her, and the children too." Jacob reached for another log and fed the flames. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, this cabin was more than shelter. It was a fragile boundary between 2 worlds that feared and hated each other, and he had just chosen a side. Lines in the snow. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in fresh silence and bone-white snow. Jacob stood at the cabin door, axe in hand, splitting logs with deliberate rhythm. Each strike into the stump punctuated his thoughts. It wasn't just the memory of soldiers or regrets he tried to chop away. It was the sound of her voice echoing again. They'll kill you if they find out. Inside the cabin, Nayeli moved like a shadow, quiet but precise. Her youngest child suckled from a cloth-wrapped flask warmed by the fire. The others sat huddled together, whispering in their native tongue, cheeks flushed with returning life. She was different this morning. Not softer, but steadier, more composed. Jacob entered, snow melting from his boots onto the floorboards. He handed her a slice of cornbread and some dried apple. "You didn't sleep," she observed, taking the food with a nod of thanks. "Didn't want the fire to die." She glanced toward the hearth, then at her children. "My people believe fire holds the spirits of our ancestors. You kept them alive too." Jacob wasn't sure what to say. Praise sat awkwardly on his shoulders. He merely nodded and sat down, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'll head into town today," he said. "Need flour. Salt, too." Her body stiffened. "It's 3 miles each way. You and the children will be safe here." She looked at him, truly looked, searching for deception. Then she nodded once. Jacob saddled his mule by midday. The trail to Bridges Post wound through a narrow gulch, flanked by cottonwoods and rock outcroppings. The snow was knee-deep, but he pressed on. He passed no one until he reached the outskirts of town. Bridges Post was little more than a cluster of wooden buildings and a few fence paddocks. The general store sat crooked beside the blacksmith shed, both coated in frost. Inside, the warmth was a welcome shock. Mrs. Kessler, the shopkeeper's wife, raised her brows when she saw him. "Well, Jacob Wyatt braves the storm," she teased. "Run out of beans again. Flour, salt, blankets if you've got them." Mrs. Kessler narrowed her eyes. "Blankets? That's new. Cold's gotta mean. Don't want frostbite sneaking up on me." She didn't press, but the pause lingered. As Jacob paid and turned to leave, a voice cut through the store behind him. "Eliza says you've been awful quiet lately." He froze. Turning, he saw Thomas Morton, a broad-shouldered man with a sneer etched permanently into his face. His thick coat was lined with silver buttons, and he smelled faintly of pipe smoke and arrogance. "She missing your little chats in the woods," Thomas added, voice sharp under the friendly tone. Jacob forced a tight-lipped smile. "I keep to myself. As always." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You might want to keep your cabin to yourself, too. Folks are talking. Someone saw you hauling something. Looked like a woman and children in the storm." Jacob's jaw clenched. "I don't owe anyone explanations." "No," Thomas said, grinning. "But secrets don't keep too long out here. Not when the wind carries them so far." Back at the cabin, Nayeli had finished cleaning the hearth with a broom Jacob thought no one had used in years. Her children sat cross-legged on the floor, learning to string old pine cones together. She looked up when he returned, reading the tension in his shoulders before he said a word. "Someone knows," she said quietly. "Not for sure," Jacob replied. "But it's starting." He unpacked the supplies in silence. She waited until the children were asleep, then sat beside him by the fire. "My people don't believe in coincidence," she said softly. "We believe every crossing of paths is chosen." Jacob stayed into the flames. "I never meant for you to be part of my troubles." She looked at him, eyes reflecting the firelight. "You didn't choose my trouble. You shared it." He turned toward her, uncertain where the conversation was leading. Her voice, her presence, they steadied something inside him he didn't know was still broken. For a moment, he imagined what it might feel like to kiss her. To feel warmth again, not borrowed in secret, but real, earned. But he pulled away from the thought, standing quickly. "I'll set another watch tonight," he said, "in case company comes sooner than we think." Nayeli didn't argue. She merely pulled the children's blankets tighter and fed another log into the fire. Outside, the moon rose over snow-covered hills, and somewhere beyond them, a storm of another kind was gathering. When hearts betray, Naeli moved like smoke through Jacob's cabin. Quiet, ever-present, and impossible to ignore. Days passed with cautious rhythm. The snow remained thick, but the children now laughed in low tones, their cheeks fuller, their steps surer. Jacob patched the roof. Naeli mended the shirts he hadn't worn in years. Something resembling peace had taken root, fragile, like frost crystals that melt at the first touch of sun. But Jacob knew better than to trust stillness. One evening, as the sky blushed purple and gold, Jacob leaned against the fence post, watching Naeli braid her eldest daughter's hair. Her hands were quick, deliberate, tender, the kind of tenderness he hadn't seen, or felt, in so long it startled him. "Do they ever ask about their father?" he asked. She didn't look up. Not out loud. Jacob nodded. The question lingered in the air between them, unanswered. That night, after the children slept, Naeli sat by the hearth while Jacob cleaned his rifle. She spoke softly. "You were a soldier once. I can see it in the way you check doors, how your back's always to the wall." Jacob paused. "I was. A long time ago. Did you ever fight my people?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, memories rising like smoke, orders barked under winter moons, screams in burning camps, the stench of ash and blood. "I did," he said finally, "and I walked away when I couldn't live with what I saw." Naeli didn't speak, but her silence held no judgment, only understanding. They were both survivors of different wars, bearing wounds invisible to the eye. Then, as if fate knew the moment was too pure, too real, it struck. A frantic knock shattered the quiet. Jacob rose, gun in hand, heart suddenly pounding. He opened the door to find Eliza Morton, breathless, her eyes wild. "You fool," she hissed. "They know." Jacob stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What are you doing here?" "You lied to me." Her voice cracked. "You said there was nothing between you and that woman." "There isn't," Jacob said, jaw tight. "Not like that. But you kept her here. You protected her. And your face, it changes when you say her name." Eliza's eyes welled with tears. "I loved you, Jacob. I still do. But they'll kill her. And maybe you, too." "I didn't ask you to come," he said. "No," she snapped. "But they followed me. They know you're harboring an Apache woman. And they know about us." His stomach sank. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a desperate whisper. Thomas heard whispers in town. "I tried to lie, but I think he already knew. He's coming. With others." Jacob's grip on his rifle tightened. "You need to leave. Get her out of here before they arrive." From inside, the door creaked open. Naeli stood in the shadows, her face unreadable. Eliza caught sight of her and froze. The two women stared at each other, neither speaking, yet a storm of words unspoken filled the space between them. Eliza broke the gaze first. "Goodbye, Jacob," she said, and vanished into the trees. Later, Naeli sat with him by the fire, her face hard, eyes fixed on the flames. "Is she your wife?" Jacob shook his head. "Your woman?" "Not anymore." Silence. "She came here to save you," Naeli said, more observation than accusation. "No, she came here because she was afraid of what she caused." Naeli turned to him. "And what did you cause?" Jacob looked at her, his voice low. "Too many things I can't take back." A long silence passed. Then, for the first time, she reached for his hand. "You saved my children. That's what I know." He felt the warmth of her palm, rough with labor, yet soft in its grip. For one breathless moment, the weight of their past receded. But outside, in the quiet woods, a flicker of torchlight glowed through the trees, unmistakable. Jacob stood slowly. "They are here." Naeli's hand slipped from his. She turned to gather her children without a word. Jacob stepped outside. A dozen men stood in the dark, torches flickering like angry stars. At their head was Thomas Morton, rifle resting on his shoulder. His eyes burned with betrayal, not just of property or pride, but something deeper. "Evening, Jacob," Thomas called. "Heard you've got company inside." "I've got people under my roof," Jacob replied. "People who haven't hurt a soul." You've been sleeping with my wife and hiding savages. That makes you the danger. I didn't ask Eliza to come to me. And that woman inside, she's running from death, not bringing it. Thomas raised his gun. We'll be the judge of that. Jacob didn't flinch. Then you'll have to come through me. The air tightened. Fingers tensed on triggers. Flames crackled, casting orange light across the snow. Behind Jacob, Nayeli stepped into view. Her children huddled close, eyes wide. She said nothing. She didn't beg. She stood tall, as if daring the mob to see her not as threat, but as mother, as survivor, as human. The settlers hesitated, and the night held its breath. Fire, forgiveness, and farewell. A thin hush stretched between the armed settlers and the quiet figures standing in the firelight. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the black sky, catching in torchlight like ashes falling from a burnt-out heaven. Jacob stepped forward. None of you came up here when I was burying my wife, he said, voice even but firm. None of you cared when I built this cabin with blood in my hands. But now you want to tear down my door over a woman and 5 freezing children. Thomas Morton's jaw flexed. He took a single step into the light, gun raised chest high. She's not one of us. She's not yours to judge, Jacob snapped. You want to call me a traitor? Fine. I broke your law, slept with your wife, kept a woman alive when your kind would have let her die in the snow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The torches trembled in a few shaking hands. Behind Jacob, Nayeli shifted slightly, her children clinging to her coat. I'm not proud of what I did, Jacob continued, but I won't apologize for saving lives. Thomas's face turned to stone. This ain't just about her. It's about you. Lying, stealing, breaking the code of this land. There's no code in letting children freeze, Jacob said. There's no honor in turning away from someone just because she looks different. A voice rose from the back. It was Eliza, half shrouded in snow and regret. Is telling the truth. Thomas turned sharply. You don't get to speak. I have to. She stepped forward. I told you about the affair because I was angry. Hurt. But I never meant to put a woman and her babies in danger. She looked at Jacob, eyes soft. He did what none of you would have. He saved them. The settlers began to murmur. Doubt moved through them like wind through brittle reeds. One man lowered his rifle. Another turned away completely. Thomas, however, remained still, eyes burning into Jacob's. She's gone by sunrise, he said coldly. Or we'll come back. Jacob nodded. That's more grace than I expected. No one moved until the torches began to retreat into the forest, swallowed one by shadow and snowfall. Thomas lingered last, eyes lingering on Eliza, then on Jacob. No words, just the sharp flick of his coat as he turned. They were gone. Back inside, the fire crackled faintly. Jacob sat on the edge of the table, arms slack, like a man who'd wrestled the weight of mountains. Nayeli stood quietly by the hearth. You told them everything. I had to. You didn't have to do it for me. I didn't, he said, voice low. I did it because it was right. A long silence followed. The fire popped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Nayeli stepped forward and placed her hand gently on his. You are not the man I feared you were. Jacob looked up, exhausted eyes meeting hers. I'm not the man I wanted to be either. Outside, dawn began to stretch its pale fingers across the treetops. They packed in silence. Jacob wrapped dried meat and flour into a satchel. He gave her a wool blanket and his old army coat. When she saw the coat, she hesitated. This was yours. It's yours now, he said. It's warmer than pride. The children hugged his legs, murmuring shy thanks. The youngest reached up and touched his beard with tiny fingers, then smiled. Jacob led them to the edge of the forest where his mule stood waiting. He'd tied a pack to its back, filled with supplies for a journey north, into land no settler would dare follow. He helped Nayeli into the saddle. She turned back one last time. Will they come for you again? Jacob shook his head. They won't need to. I've already lost enough. A silence passed. Then she said, You will find peace, Jacob Wyatt. Maybe not soon, but someday. She offered a small smile, something fragile, sacred. Then she turned the mule and rode into the snowy woods, her children trailing behind on foot like shadows wrapped in dawn. Jacob stood there long after they disappeared. Back at the cabin, he set to work rebuilding the fence. Not because it was broken, but because his hands needed purpose. The snow had stopped falling. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun now lit the pines in gold. He had given up a woman, a secret, and perhaps any hope of belonging. But in doing so, he'd salvaged something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity. Final line. He had lost a lover, a tribe, and perhaps even a future. But in that winter, he had remembered how to be a man.